Today we're talking about something that affects every single person listening.
The Renters' Rights Act, it's the biggest change that we've seen for 30 plus years within the private rental sector. It's huge.
Being a landlord is higher risk, is what I'm hearing.
It is.
Being a tenant, you are more protected.
Correct. How are we going to be able to house the UK population? 15 households for one new tenancy. Of all of the things that are within the Renters' Rights Act, I think this is the one that's a fundamental mistake. You've got people saying, you can make millions, just buy these properties, rent them out. Yeah, and it's just nonsense. You do not make millions.
What do you think, in your perspective, is the most misunderstood part of the Renters' Rights Act? Louisa Sedgwick has spent over 30 years in the mortgage and property world. She's currently the Managing Director for Mortgages at Paragon, one of the UK's leading specialist lenders. She has worked at the very heart of the buy-to-let market, leading teams, shaping lender policy, influencing industry standards and helping both professional landlords and first-time buyers navigate a sector that is constantly evolving. She's known for her clarity, her honesty, and her ability to explain incredibly complex legislation in a way that actually makes sense. And she's one of the most respected voices when it comes to the Renters' Rights Act, the future of the private rental sector, and what this all means for the next generation of buyers. Louisa, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So I want to start by speaking about something you've spoken beautifully about for a long time, and that is the idea that the private rental sector is not the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it can be an incredibly important stepping stone for first-time buyers. So can we start there? What is the real value of the PRS? So I'm going to call it PRS just so that we don't have to constantly say private rental sector, as a stepping stone for first-time buyers, and why does renting matter?
So I suppose, putting it into real terms, first-time buyers now, the average property price is 7.7 times their income.
It's mad.
So it's largely unaffordable for the vast majority of first-time buyers. So unless they want to live at home forever, and a mother of a 20-year-old, I don't want that to be the case, then, the other option available to them is to rent. And I think for so long, renting has been, to some degree, demonised by a number of people within the industry, suggesting that landlords are stealing first-time buyer homes.
Right.
If you look at the numbers of purchases for last year for first-time buyers, there were in excess of 390,000 properties were bought by first-time buyers, which is fantastic and move in the right direction. It's brilliant, versus 69,000 bought by landlords.
Okay.
So it kind of just highlights the difference that, yes, historically, landlords may well have bought up properties that first-time buyers should probably have bought at that time. But if you look at those affordability constraints, first-time buyers are outstripping new landlords by 3-4 times the value.
Okay.
So I think it's really important just to bring that to life.
Yeah. So the data is actually not really representing the story that people believe.
Yeah, today I think that's absolutely the case.
Okay. So for those people listening, what are the genuine benefits of renting before buying? Because there's so many people that's going to be listening to this thinking, well, how can I rent and save up a deposit to buy, for example? And they think it's compromising one for the other. So what are the genuine benefits?
So it is challenging, isn't it? Because paying rent and trying to save at the same time is virtually impossible. And I think up until very recently, where we haven't seen any schemes from lenders supporting borrowers from rental into buying. So, we now see some more schemes where they actually acknowledge the rental payments that have been made. So there's less of a demand for the first-time buyer to save in the same ways they perhaps have tried to do in the past and failed to do. So as far as the private rental sector is concerned and the importance of try before you buy.
Yeah.
I think if I was a lender lending to a first-time buyer, would I think that it was the right thing to do to lend to somebody who's literally just leaving home with no experience, nothing behind them in respect of having paid bills or lived in a community or added value to their community? I think that's probably a greater risk than looking at a first-time buyer who's actually left home, established a household, paid their bills, figured out whether or not the person that they left home to live with is a person that they want to continue living with and commit
Very
to a
valid.
mortgage with. Very valid. Is that absolutely the right thing? Whereas if they actually rent first for a period, whatever that defined period might well be, and of course the Renters' Rights Act is changing that anyway, they can be a little bit more selective about how long they choose to rent.
Okay.
So if they do that for a defined period, then it just gives them a little bit more of an idea of exactly what's to be expected when they do come to take on a mortgage for a much longer period of time.
What do you think first-time buyers then learn from renting that sets them up to be better homeowners later then? You've mentioned a few things there that you touched on, but is there anything more specific?
Yeah, so I think, if you look at how to manage a household,
Yeah.
that's a huge thing.
It
And
is.
actually and I'm still learning now, and I've had a house for a long time, but, how to manage a household, how to manage your bills, how to manage your finances more effectively.
Yeah.
How to say I mentioned before, how to live in a community, what's your part in a community, and particularly if you're living in a smaller community, then, how do you play your part in that? How do you manage to work effectively with your neighbours? If you're living in a flat in central London, how does that all work? So I think you're learning so much just by moving away from home for probably what is the first time into your own home for a period of time. So I think there's lots of advantages. And yes, there's some expenditure there, but it's also that helps you to learn to maintain your commitments going forward.
And what strikes me is I think people listening, they may not understand what lenders take into account. I think we caveat here, lenders actually don't take into account at the moment, do they? Whether you've been renting before or not, or am I missing something? And they do take that into account in a subtle way.
So I would say in a subtle way.
Okay, that's interesting.
Because if you look at, for example, if you look at your credit profile and you look at how you have paid your bills, for example, if you're living at home and the only credit that you've got is maybe a telephone bill, then you're not building up a great deal of credit. So that will impact your credit score.
Yeah.
So if you have got commitments elsewhere outside of just a telephone, mobile phone bill, for example, and you do have credit commitments and you've been seen to maintain those credit commitments, then that will impact positively on your credit score. So whilst they won't look at it directly and go, actually, I can see that you have paid your gas bill on time, etc. If you don't, naturally that's going to go against you. But if you are maintaining credit commitments, then that will impact your credit score positively. Credit. Yeah.
Okay, so it's subtle. Would you like to see them take it into account more directly?
I absolutely would. And some of the innovation from some of the new, not even some of the new lenders, but some of the lenders that we see that are bringing out new improved innovations around taking into account rental payments when it comes to affordability. I mean, it's ridiculous that it's taken as long as it has for lenders to come up with that innovation. And yes, I think they have been hamstrung a little bit by the regulator. But that's exactly what it should be.
It should.
Yeah, if you can afford a rent, that's largely going to be more expensive than your mortgage, albeit that obviously fluctuates, but for the most part, it will be more expensive. If you can afford your rent, you can afford your mortgage. So going back to the other point, if you've got somebody that's just leaving home for the first time and taking on a mortgage, they have got no proof of being able to pay their commitments for a period of time. So I genuinely think, going back to my try before you buy, that all should be taken into account when anybody's looking to lend to these tenants that are either would-be first-time buyers or second-time buyers, third-time buyers if they've had, a life event where they've had to then go into rental accommodation, then absolutely it should be taken into account.
Yeah, I agree. So I don't think a lot of people realise how enormous the private rental sector actually is. So can we bring that to life? What monetary value does the private rental sector bring to the UK economy?
So it is massive.
Is it massive?
It's absolutely
okay, let's shock
huge.
everyone.
I will shock everybody with this because I was shocked when I read this. So we've done some recent research with PwC. So it's very well audited, as you can imagine. Working with PwC. So the actual monetary value of the private rental sector, as it stands at the minute, is £45 billion per year.
Oh my God. To the UK economy.
£45 billion to the UK economy. That is from the private rental sector, whether that be directly influenced by individual landlords or renters or the secondary, so any maintenance and letting agents, all of that.
Oh My gosh.
And to add to that, there are 400,000 jobs associated with the private rental sector.
It is definitely underestimated then.
It's underestimated and it's undervalued because it makes up for 20% of all housing.
Is the private rental
It's
sector.
the private rental sector. Now, there are people within the private rental sector that shouldn't be in the private rental sector. They should be in social housing, for example.
Okay.
But we know there's a social housing shortage. There's 2 million households on the social housing waiting list. So they are sat within, so they're housed within the private rental sector. So if the intent is to grow home ownership and to shrink the private rental sector, which kind of feels like that is the direction of travel, then we need to build more homes, more affordable homes, which of course we're not doing. And in particular, within the social housing sector, we need to build some more homes within the social housing sector so you can move people out of the private rental sector in order to put them into the social housing sector. And then that supply-demand mismatch, which we're experiencing at the minute, depending on whether you talk to Rightmove or Zoopla, you're talking about 15 households for every new tenancy.
15 households want
15 households for one new tenancy.
As in they all want that?
They all want that. So they're queuing up for that one new tenancy.
Wow, that is an important stat as well.
We can explore that even further within the Renters' Rights Act and the impact of some of the changes and how that's going to influence that further. But you kind of look and think, how are we going to be able to house the UK population? And if you look at some of the ONS stats, they're suggesting that we will be inviting 5 million new migrants into the country between now and 2030. And we know 85% of all migrants come to work in the country will rent. Wow. So you kind of think that the demand for the private rental sector is only going to grow. It's not going to shrink. Yeah.
Wow. And I think when people talk about landlords, there's often this idea that it's all big corporations and wealthy individuals.
Yeah.
But in reality, who actually makes up the landlord population in the UK and how dependent is the UK economy on them? We know how huge it is now.
Yeah.
Those stats don't lie. And like you say, it's only going to grow. So, what can we say about that?
So again, interestingly, 83% of all of the properties within the private rental sector owned by landlords that have 1 to 3 properties. So very, very small properties. That's very, very small property portfolios. 83%, it's huge. The rest, the 17% that's remaining actually makes up, the 17% of landlords actually makes up for 49% of all of the properties. So a very small number of landlords own a lot of properties.
Okay. So 85% own 1 to 3, but the other own 49% of the property.
The rest of it, So you can see the influence of very big landlords.
Yeah, you can.
Getting bigger. As some of these smaller landlords are looking to exit the market. And yes, we talk about a mass exodus of landlords from the market. We haven't seen a mass exodus, but you're naturally starting to see a lot of the landlords that maybe only had 1 or 2 properties, accidental landlords, hold them in their own name. It's just no longer a viable proposition because of all the changes with taxation, legislation, etc. So they are naturally leaving the market.
Okay.
So some first-time buyers, as we've talked about with the stats, they are buying some of those properties and or second-time buyers. But if you look at various properties like HMOs, so houses in multiple occupancy, multi-unit blocks, they are not first-time buyer properties. No. So they're being then bought up by other landlords. So the size of that landlord demographic is just going to the bigger landlords will get bigger and the smaller landlords will get smaller.
So I wonder what it will look like, that 85 split.
You kind of question, fast forward 5 years, I think it will look very different, in particular because of the changes with the Renters' Rights Act.
Which I'm looking forward to diving into a little bit more. So I think let's talk about that, because we can't have this conversation without addressing everything that's happening. And I don't know about you, but it's everywhere. It's all people talk to me about at dinner parties.
Yeah.
So what do you think about this? What is happening? What do you think, in your perspective, is the most misunderstood part of the Renters' Rights Act?
I kind of think because, we just said about the dinner party conversations, there is a lot of chatter. And I think for the most part, landlords have pretty much got their heads around it. And I think they pretty much understand it. Letting agents, yes, arguably, I think they're also in a really good place because, we have been talking about this for such a long time.
Yeah.
Tenants, I think, are probably heading in the right direction towards exactly what this means to them. But going back to my earlier point, when you've got 270 pages of legislation, it's going to take quite a while to get your head around it. And Renters' Rights Act is coming in various phases. So the first phase is definitely heavy on the landlords, with something from the tenants. And then phases 2 and phases 3 are going to be more focused on what the government have to do in respect of supporting the Renters' Rights Act. So I think for the most part, I think it's pretty well understood. The government have been brilliant with their communication. If people were to go onto the .gov website, they will see lots of information around the Renters' Rights Act. And I think it's really easy to find your way through that. So that is helpful, largely for landlords, for mortgage brokers as well. If you're talking to your customers, you need to know what's happening within the Renters' Rights Act. Definitely. Even if you only touch upon a buy-to-let landlord occasionally, I think it's really important that you get to your head around it. And the basics are the basics. So I think they're pretty well understood.
And when does this start?
1st of May. So phase 1 is the 1st of May. Phases 2 and 3 will come later. So phase 2 is going to be around the landlord database, which is being built out by the government as it stands at the minute, and the ombudsman. So there will be a landlord ombudsman. Right. So if there's any small claims, or landlords need help and support with anything, similarly, the tenants will be able to use that. So these 2 are coming into phase 2. And then phase 3, which I arguably think should have been phase 1, is the Decent Home Standards and Awab's Law. So Awab's Law, if you remember, was the young boy that died in social housing, not in private rental, but in social housing in Rochdale. And it was around the fact that he inhaled mould spores for so long. And so for me, that was probably the thing that should have gone first.
Yeah, make sure not
should have been pushed out to 2030. So that's where we're going. But that leads us really nicely into what's happening within within the MEES. So basically improving the sustainability and the standards of properties within the private rental sector is the next phase of legislation.
So much has changed and so much is changing. But can we just break it down for people that have heard a little bit more somewhere else? Let's really give them an overview. What are the most significant recent legislative changes impacting the private rental sector?
So there's probably 5 key points that people need to know. The first one is the abolition of Section 21. So Section 21 is no fault eviction.
Okay.
So basically, if a landlord wanted to evict a tenant, they could pretty much do so for any reason.
Okay.
So Section 21 is going to be replaced by Section 8. Now, Section 8 can only be invoked if a tenant is in arrears by 3 months or more.
Okay.
Or if there's antisocial behaviour, that's ongoing antisocial behaviour, then a landlord can evict, and or the landlord either wants to move into the property themselves or sell the property. So those are the only 3 reasons, or the main 3 reasons why you would issue a Section 8, and they can only do that once the tenant is 3 months in arrears.
So humour me, what would be other reasons right now before this Renters' Rights Act that somebody might evict that's caused them to put this in?
I don't like them.
Oh, okay.
They're not they sporadically pay their rent. There is antisocial behaviour. I want to increase the rent, and so the only way I can do that is to evict my tenant. So all of the reasons around the removal of the Section 21 notice make sense. They absolutely make sense. And if you look at them on paper, you kind of go, that why would you not? Moving to a little bit more radical towards a Section 8 eviction means that, as I say, the tenant's 3 months in arrears before you can take action. We know that the court reform hasn't happened, so we've got some challenges within the court and there's some delays within the courts. Yeah. At some point in time, they're going to digitalise the process, so that will make it a lot easier. But you could now find, because of the delays within the courts, that a landlord could be sat on a property with tenants, unable to evict them for anything up to 12 months, and that property is not performing in any way, and probably is getting worse if the tenant's not happy and not paying their rent. The chances are they're probably not maintaining the property particularly well. So the removal from Section 21 to Section 8 on paper looks fine, and it definitely favours the tenant.
Yeah.
So that's probably the first one. The second one is the removal of ASTs, so no longer assured short hold tenancies, which we've known for so long, and they now move into periodic tenancies.
Okay.
So they have no end date. So there's no fixed end date with that. So typically at the moment, the AST would run for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, however that works for both the tenant and the landlord. They would generally agree on a contract, and that's how it would run. Whereas now from the 1st of May, it will just run.
Right. So just with a notice period.
So there's no notice period. So no end date. So the only way a landlord can remove that tenant is if the tenant elects to leave, which they can do with 2 months' notice, or they stop paying the rent, or
they sell.
So
or they move into the property.
So the landlord is very restricted.
Okay.
So that's the second one. The other one is rent increases. So typically at the moment, a landlord can increase the rent as and however they feel fit.
Okay.
They don't tend to, because landlords that have a mortgage, for example, tend to fix for 5 years, and they're very happy that the mortgage is covered by the rental plus any excess.
Yeah.
So they don't tend to increase rent. So this is now moderate increases every year in line with rental price increases and or market rate.
Okay.
So the landlord can only increase the rent once a year. My personal view is that they'll increase the rent once a year, and actually the tenant will be worse off because typically they weren't increasing rents.
Because they know they can. That's the only way they can.
Because that's the only way that they can do it. If the tenant is not happy with the rental increase, then they can go to a tribunal, and then they can, challenge it.
Yeah.
Again, we know the tribunals are not set up for this. So if they choose to disagree with the rent, they don't make any rental payments until such time as it's been resolved within the tribunal, and then rent payments start again. So again, you could find that you've got any length of time whilst the tribunal is running, and there's that property is not gaining it, not getting any income on that property. So again, it's potentially a problem for the landlord.
So if they decide to appeal and not pay while they're appealing.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. The next one, and this is that I was quite passionate about this one, I'll explain my rationale behind it, is rents in advance. So you used to be able to pay rent in advance, and typically a tenant would pay 6 months rent to secure a property.
Right.
So going back to my 15-to-1 ratio earlier, so 15 new tenants to every one property. If you had a tenant that maybe had challenges with a credit history, maybe were new to the country, had no credit history or a poor credit history, maybe didn't necessarily have a job and were reliant on universal credit, for example, versus somebody who had a great job in the city, paying the rent, and always, you could see that was already proven. The way in which you would find yourself on an equal footing in essence, is you would pay 6 months in advance.
Okay.
So you pay your rent in advance. The landlord says, okay, you're good for it for 6 months. I'm quite happy that I will rent the property to you.
Yeah.
Whereas now, because they're not able to secure that property with rent in advance, you've got all of those vulnerabilities, in effect, versus somebody who has a great credit history, great job, etc., etc. The landlord, knowing that they can't evict this customer or the tenant if they get it wrong, is very, very likely to go for the person that's maybe got a really good credit history versus maybe somebody who's slightly more vulnerable and probably needed to get that property.
Yeah.
So I think
they're always going to be the bottom of that list.
They're always going to be the bottom of that list. And the fact that they don't now have any negotiation, or they have no tools to negotiate, then I genuinely think that of all of the things that are within the Renters' Rights Act, I think this is the one that's a fundamental mistake that's been enacted. However, it will play out in time, and we'll see. You also saw that new students come into the country, for example, would pay 6 months in advance. Even students that are maybe relying on a grant to pay their rent would pay 6 months in advance.
Okay.
So they're not able to do that to secure the property. Once they're in the property, they can pay in advance, but to secure the property, they can't.
So it can't be a negotiation tool.
Can't be a negotiation tool.
And what about these properties that are on historic low rent compared to the market? Do you think they're likely to bring their rent up to market standards because to protect themselves?
I think it's very likely. Very likely. I mean, it depends on the landlord's circumstances. So we've got an ageing population of landlords because buy-to-let's been around for 30 years now, nearly as long as me. So buy-to-let's been here for 30 years. And so we've got a lot of those landlords that came into the market really early and now reaching the point in which the want this as part of their pension. That's
Yeah,
what the
that was
provision
what they
was
did
for.
for, yeah.
Absolutely. So they may decide to sell the property, etc. And then you've also got the aging tenant. So you've got tenants that are staying within the properties for such a long time
Yeah.
and expecting to continue to pay those low rents. If you have a landlord that elects to sell,
Yeah.
what happens to our aging tenants? So I think we've also got another problem alongside an aging landlord, just an aging population in general, but you've got that aging tenant. So back to the Renters' Rights Act.
Yeah.
The other one is that a landlord can no longer decline a request for a pet, so long as it's reasonable.
Really?
Now, if you're in a high-rise block in central London and you want to bring in your bull mastiff, I think that's probably quite unreasonable.
Yeah.
But if you want a cat or a hamster or in
You're
that sort of
allowed.
circumstances, absolutely fine. You cannot decline that.
I wonder why they did that one.
I think my guess would be it's probably a really good vote winner.
Okay, so
Would be alongside a lot of these changes that
Yeah.
are going to be enacted within the Renters' Rights Act. You're then looking at all the Warm Homes Plan, and MEES and various things like that, which is the next level of legislation that's going to hit the landlords in particular, on top of all of the other compounded changes. And if you look at the Renters' Rights Act, there's 270 pages
that you've got to read
within
as a
this
landlord.
legislation that the landlords have to read, because if they don't, they can have fines of up to £30,000.
Wow. I understand now why it's at every dinner party conversation.
Every
right
dinner
now.
party conversation. I've lived and breathed it for months and months and months. I was quite grumpy when I first saw what I thought was the original Renters' Rights Act. I think where we've ended up is probably quite balanced.
Okay.
It is balanced in favour of the tenant, but it was always going to be balanced in favour of the tenant. But I think there are a number of unintended consequences that will play out over time. And I suspect that at some point there will be a review of what's likely to be enacted and what potentially might change, just to rebalance the pendulum back towards the landlord, so you've got a bit of equilibrium.
So, Louisa, what are the headlines about the Renters' Rights Act?
So, key headlines: abolition of Section 21, moving on to Section 8. Rents in advance, so no longer paying rents in advance. There is an annual rent review that's permitted. Moving away from assured short-hold tenancies into a periodic tenancy, and then finally the around pets. So pets will be permitted.
Are there any more changes coming that landlords and renters need to prepare for?
No, I think the Renters' Rights Act is the biggest. It's the biggest change that we've seen for 30 plus years within the private rental sector. It's huge. That legislation is massive. But as I say, I think that it's been tabled really well, and so I think everybody should have a reasonable level of understanding, and once you get past the basics, it's fairly straightforward. So no more legislation around that piece, but then the next legislation that just touched upon is the MEES legislation, or EPC legislation.